The second talk of the 2020 Graph Signal Processing Workshop will be delivered by Edwin Hancock. For many years, Edwin was a professor at York University in UK, and he is also with the Royal Society. He has a distinguished career in the general areas of computer vision and pattern recognition, where he has written hundreds of papers that accumulate more than 10,000 citations. He has been interested in the synergies between networks and machine learning for a long time, and today he will be talking about entropic analysis of network time series. In his talk, Edwin will present recent work that illustrates how the ideas from spectrogram theory and statistical physics can be used to compute network entropy. He will then explain how this network entropy can be leveraged to develop tools for analyzing network and graph time series. Thank you, Edwin, for recording this talk. I hope that the audience will enjoy it.
Hello, I'm isolated in York in the north of England. I was looking forward to presenting this talk in Madrid. Obviously, circumstances have overtaken us. Today what I want to talk about is the entropic analysis of network time series. So this is a piece of work that builds on a study that I must have commenced about 10 years ago and have worked on with a number of colleagues and PhD students. Some of them are mentioned here: Richard Wilson, who's a faculty member at York, Zhihong Zhang, who former PhD student who now teaches at Xiamen University, Lin Han, who works for an AI company in Beijing, Dongdong Wang, who is a PhD student at Xiamen University, Jianjia Wang, who is a former PhD student and faculty member at Shanghai University, Lu Bai, who is a faculty member and former PhD student at the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing, Cheng Yi, who now works for AstraZeneca and was formerly a PhD student, Andrea Torsello and Giorgia Minello, both who've worked with me as PhD students and are now at the University of Venice. So let me first set the scene to try to motivate what I'm attempting to do, and before I get stuck into the mathematical detail. So I think it's fair to say that over the last 10 years, network data representations have become widely accepted in machine learning and have led to the studies of whole new areas of computer science like complex networks. And the goal is basically to understand the interactions in a complex system, and examples might include social networks, protein-protein interaction networks, the internet, etc. So let me give you some examples. So this picture here shows the World Transportation Network, and you see the nodes in this network represent airports, and the edges airline routes between them. And you'll notice that not all airports are equal, that some are hubs and many airlines fly in and out of them, and then there are subsidiary routes that take you to local destinations. This is a more abstract representation. It represents the relationships between different fields of philosophical thought, and the representation emphasizes those schools of philosophical thought that are central to the discipline and those that are marginal or subsidiary to the main fields of thought. This example takes us into the domain of biology. They're protein-protein interaction networks. The two networks represent the pattern of proteins expressed from different organisms. The organism on the left-hand side is more complex than the organism on the right. And by studying these networks, one hopes one might actually be able to say something about the organism that produced them. And so this really leads us on to one of the main themes in this talk, and that is the idea of being able somehow to understand the complexity of a network, and through that measure of complexity, understand something about the system that produced it. And then my final example, which I shall return to later on in the talk, are networks representing activation patterns in brains. These images are obtained by fMRI. The activation patterns are determined by the rate of blood oxygen uptake in different parts of the brain, and we look for correlations between those blood oxygen uptakes in different regions of the brain to see whether there's correlated activity. Now, these images are the activation networks for different for patients in different stages of Alzheimer's disease, and so the two images, the two networks on the top row represent patients with Alzheimer's and those who are in a non-Alzheimer's control group, and you can see that there are different structures present in these two networks. One of the things you would like to be able to do in this data is to see whether you are looking at a brain where there is the early onset of Alzheimer's disease, and in the lower row we have the early and late onset of Alzheimer's disease, and again you can see that there are different structures in those networks. So these are networks taken over quite long time differences. They're actually not for longitudinal sets of patients. They do indicate that the study of these networks can tell us something about the development of Alzheimer's disease. So the examples that I've just shown you are all causal networks. We have nodes representing objects or agents. They could be financial entities or brain regions, and the edges indicate that there is a causal relationship between those regions, and these edges can either be directed or undirected. And in order to extract the edges, what we do is we look for some measure of correlation or causality between the different nodes. And so, for instance, correlation, Granger causality, or transfer entropy are all possible measures for characterizing the relationship between nodes and deciding whether or not a connection exists. So the goal really is to determine whether there is a link between network structure and the function of the system being represented by that network. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is to determine whether a change in structure signals a change in function, and what the relationship is between that change in structure and change in function. So if you want to look at this at a sort of a higher scientific level, the questions we are asking are: what can we learn about the function performed by a network from its structure? How do changes in structure reflect changes in function? And can we find network complexity characterizations that allow us to analyze these relationships? Now, what I'm going to come down on later on the talk is entropy as a tool for doing this, but what I want to do is to continue to motivate the use of entropy over a few slides. So the attempt to quantify the intrinsic complexity of a graph or a network has been a problem that has been present in the computer science and mathematics literature for many decades. And so you can trace the work back to some of the work of Biggs in algebraic graph theory in the mid-1970s, where he demonstrated there was a link between the number of spanning trees in a network, that was the measure of complexity, and the Laplacian eigenvalues. And so since this time, people have explored a number of different ways of trying to find numerical characterizations of network complexity that can be easily computed, but are very expressive in terms of the way in which they capture complexity. So we can look at, for instance, the work of Manoli, where there was a formula expressing the complexity of a network in terms of the numbers of vertices, edges, and proper paths. People have also looked at the linear complexity associated with the adjacency matrix of a network, and then information theoretic indices have also been used. Work on properties like the chromatic entropy have also been influential in this area, and if you go back to the early work, Corner's complexity measure has links with combinatorial graph theory and also with coding theory. So if we look at this work, we can really divide it into two different approaches. The first is randomness complexity. The idea here is to probabilistically compute the degree of disorganization or randomness of a network, and for instance Shannon entropy proves to be a way of doing this. The other approach is statistical complexity, where the aim is to characterize the combinatorial structure of a network using statistical features. And so these might be node or degree statistics or properties of the Laplacian spectrum. So if we approach networks at the sort of complexity level, what are we attempting to do? Well, if we attempt to measure the modular structure of a network, this can be computationally very cumbersome because we're effectively trying to answer quite detailed combinatorial questions about the structure of a network. Entropy serves as a very convenient way, a very convenient single measure of how the structure of a network changes with time, which allows us to detect and understand events that cause sudden changes in structure. Not only that, but it allows us to leverage physics and information theory to understand the processes going on in a network and allow us to build models of a network function and how this varies with time. So in this section, what I would like to do is to pick up the idea of entropy and start to develop some mathematical framework for this study and to show you some of the contributions that we've made in trying to compute network entropy using simple degree statistics for networks. So I guess everybody's familiar with the concept of entropy. It's a measure of unpredictability or information content of a signal. Shannon defines the entropy associated with a random variable to be the expectation of the information content of that random variable. And if you define informativeness to be the logarithm of 1 over the probability distribution for the random variable, then entropy turns out to be the expectation minus the expectation of the logarithm of probability, and the famous Shannon formula results immediately from that. If we have a series of samples of a random variable, then entropy is minus the sum of p log p, where p of x is the probability of the observed sample x. Entropy, of course, exists as a central concept in physics. First appears in thermodynamics, where it is taken to be a measure of disorder of a system, and if you measure the change in energy with entropy, this is the temperature of the system, and that's a measure of the degree of thermodynamic disorder that exists within the system. In statistical mechanics, entropy is a measure of the uncertainty of the microstates of a system and is defined to be minus k, the sum of pi log pi, where p of I is the probability of being in a particular microstate. This idea can be extended into quantum mechanical systems. So if we have a density matrix representing the confusion of states, that is to say a matrix which characterizes the probability of being the different quantum states of a system, then the entropy is defined as the minus k, the Boltzmann constant, times the trace of rho log rho, where rho is a density matrix. And this can be expressed simply in terms of the Shannon entropy associated with the eigenvalues of the density matrix. And then I've obviously in the previous slide shown you the role of entropy in information theory due to Shannon. So how can we use entropy to characterize a network? Well, the basic question we're asking here is how random is the network we observe? And so if we want to answer that question, we need a probability distribution over the structural components of the network. One way of doing this would be to ask how likely it is to find a random walker at different nodes in the network, and then to use the entropy associated with this probability distribution as a measure of the entropy of the network. But of course, there are other ways of approaching this problem. I mean, people like Erdos and Corner have been working on the concept of entropy and its link to network colorings since the 1960s and 70s. So one of the things which has been discovered is that if we're going to compute the entropy using combinatorial approaches, then we have to address the problem that the complexity grows exponentially with the size of the structure. And so it would be very convenient if we had powerful ways of computing entropy that were not limited by the combinatorial complexity of the structure that we're looking at. So let me now take you along the path that we followed in order to develop tractable entropies for analysing and representing graph structures. So here the link we're going to explore is a link between the von Neumann entropy. I've defined that earlier. That's the effectively the entropy associated with the density matrix eigenvalues and the spectra of graphs. So this is just standard material on how one represents a graph using matrices. There are three matrices of interest. The first is the adjacency matrix, which represents the adjacency relationships within a graph, normally taken to be 1 if there's an edge connecting a pair of nodes, 0 otherwise. The degree matrix is a diagonal matrix which captures the degree of individual nodes in the network along the diagonal, and then from those two matrices we compute the Laplacian matrix, which is the degree matrix minus the adjacency matrix or the weighted adjacency matrix. So here's an example of doing that. I have a simple graph here consisting of 4 nodes. I have written down the degree matrix in the top left-hand corner, so the diagonal elements of that matrix 2, 3, 3, 2 represent the degrees of the individual nodes in that network. Then we compute the adjacency matrix, which has 0s or 1 depending on whether there is an edge connecting a pair of nodes. I've taken an undirected graph here, and so the adjacency matrix is symmetric. And then from the degree matrix and the adjacency matrix we compute the Laplacian matrix by matrix subtraction. So how can we compute entropy, the von Neumann entropy associated with a graph? Well, there was an interesting piece of work by 2 Italian scientists about 10 years ago, Passerini and Severini, who posited that the normalized Laplacian of a graph can be interpreted as the density matrix for the graph Hamiltonian. So the idea here is that the density matrix is the normalized Laplacian divided by the number of nodes. Well, normalized Laplacian is the ordinary Laplacian pre and post multiplied by 1 over the square root of the degree matrix. So one can decompose the normalized Laplacian into eigenvectors and eigenvalues. I perform that decomposition on the extreme left on the first equation on this page. And if we have the eigenvalues of the normalized Laplacian to hand, then the von Neumann entropy which I compute setting the Boltzmann constant to 1, is minus the trace rho log rho. Rho is normalized Laplacian divided by the number of nodes, and that means that the von Neumann entropy is minus the sum of the normalized Laplacian eigenvalues divided by the number of nodes in the graph times the logarithm of the same thing. So effectively, the Shannon entropy associated with normalized Laplacian eigenvalues divided by the number of nodes in the graph. Unfortunately, if I want to compute that formula, I have to compute the eigendecomposition of the Laplacian matrix. That is, at best, cubic, and so it would be nice to have faster methods which can be used to compute this quantity. And that's what I did with Lin Han when we started to look at this problem back in the early 2010s. So the first example here is for undirected graphs. If you want to read about this, we have a paper in PAMI which appears in 2015, and the work was done about 2 or 3 years before the paper appeared. So our idea here is to approximate the P log P Shannon entropy term by the quadratic approximation P times 1 minus P. So if I do that, then it turns out that the von Neumann entropy is the sum lambda hat I over V times 1 minus the same quantity summed over all eigenvalues of the graph. Now I can rewrite that as two terms. The first is 1 over the number of nodes in the graph times the sum of the normalized Laplacian eigenvalues. And the second is 1 over V squared times the sum over normalized Laplacian eigenvalues squared. You'll notice the sum of the normalized Laplacian eigenvalues as being the trace of the normalized Laplacian, and the sum over the normalized Laplacian eigenvalues squared being the trace of the normalized Laplacian squared. So on the bottom line, I rewrite the von Neumann entropy using those two trace relations. And on the next slide, what I do is I make use of the fact that the trace of a normalized Laplacian is the number of nodes in the graph, and the trace of a normalized Laplacian squared is the number of nodes in the graph plus this sum. It's 1 over du times dv, where du is the degree of node u, dv is the degree of node v, and there is an edge connecting those two nodes in the graph. So I take all edges in the graph, I take the product du dv for that edge, and I take the reciprocal of that to compute the trace of normalized Laplacian squared. Now I can assemble those two terms to compute my quadratic approximation to the von Neumann entropy, and it's just 1 times 1 minus v, number of nodes in the graph, minus 1 over v squared times the sum over all edges 1 over du dv. And then I've illustrated at the bottom here an example edge connecting, undirected edge connecting nodes du and dv. So this is an example of how we could compute this. So here's a graph with nodes of various degrees. I put the degrees in the inside the nodes, and we can simply apply this formula on an edge-by-edge basis to a network like that in order to compute its entropy. Now, what does this mean? Well, it's interesting to look at the different extremal cases of the entropy and to think what kinds of structures those correspond to. So, the entropy is minimum when the degrees on the edges are minimum, and that means that we're looking at structures such as rings or stars, and I've shown examples of those. On the other hand, the entropy is maximum when the degree is maximum, and that's the case for a fully connected or complete graph. So in the previous section, we computed the entropy for an undirected graph, Can this calculation we perform be extended to directed graphs? Well, the answer is yes, provided we allow the representation of the network to become a little bit more complicated. So here's an example of a directed graph. So rather than simply characterizing each node by its degree, that is to say the number of edges that are connected to that node, we distinguish between those edges that are incoming and those edges which are outgoing from the node. So I add two degrees now to each node. The first is the in degree, the number of incoming edges, and the second number is the out degree, or number of outgoing edges. And so here is a directed graph. Each node has an in degree and an out degree. And if we're dealing with representations like this, then there are particular types of nodes which are of particular interest, and these are sinks and sources. A sink is a node which only has incoming edges. It has out degree 0, and a source is a node which has no incoming edges, only outgoing edges, and so the in degree is 0 and the out degree is non-zero. So we're now in a world where we have directed edges. Each directed edge is characterized by 4 numbers. We have, for each node connected by a directed edge, we have an in degree and an out degree. And so for node U, the in degree is du in and the out degree is du out. Now before I proceed to develop the formula for entropy, or rather present it to you, we're going to simplify the edge set a little bit, and I want to distinguish between those edges which are unidirectional, that is to say we have an edge in only one direction. I'm going to call that set E1, and then I'm going to have the set of edges which are bidirectional, and that is to say we have edges in both directions. So if we have a pair of nodes, that is to say they're connected both from the first node to the second node and from the second node to the first node. There are 2 directed edges associated with the edge. And the edge set of the graph is a union of these 2 sets. The set of unidirectional edges, those that are in one way only, is E1, and the set of bidirectional edges, those that are go both ways, is E2. So what we did is we have used formulas for the directed graph Laplacian due to Fan Chung, and followed the same methodology as we followed for the undirected case to develop formulas for the entropy of a directed graph. So I'll just present the formulas. They can be organized in a number of ways, but I think the most informative one is the one at the bottom of this slide. So now we have the entropy is a sort of bunch of factors, constant factors depending on the nodes in the graph. So it's 1 minus 1 over the number of nodes, which is what we got before. Now minus 1 over twice the number of nodes squared, and a term that depends on the in and out degrees of the different nodes. So the first term we encounter is a sum over all edges in the graph, and we first have a quantity du in divided by du out, and you can think of this as the fan in, fan out ratio of the node. It's the ratio of incoming edges to outgoing edges. And that multiplies the quantity 1 over d out u times d in v, which is analogous to the 1 over du dv term we had in the undirected case. And so this is that quantity is summed over all edges, whether they're undirected, whether they're unidirectional, or bidirectional. And then we subtract a term for those edges which are bidirectional, and that the term associated with those edges is 1 over du out times dv out. So this has some similarities to the previous formula, except now we distinguish between in and out degrees. There are two interesting cases that we can consider when we're looking at that formula. One is to consider strongly directed graphs. Now those are graphs which have only unidirectional edges, there are no bidirectional edges, in which case the entropy is determined entirely by the first term in the expression I showed you on the previous slide. The second case, so we can extend that a little bit, and if we define the in to out degree ratio for the node u as du in divided by du out, we can write that formula in terms of the fan-out ratios for nodes u and v and the out degrees on node u and node v. So that formula is now written in a rather more coherent way than the formula that I showed you earlier. Then secondly, we can take the case of weakly directed graphs. Here there are very few unidirectional edges, and most of the edges are bidirectional, and you get the formula appearing on this slide for the directed graph entropy. So in the previous sections of the talk, I showed you how to compute the entropy for undirected and directed graphs using the degrees of the nodes. We looked at some of the extremal cases for those entropies, and what I would like to do in this part of the talk is show how we can apply these formula to understand a network time series. That network time series is taken from a New York Stock Exchange. This data extends over 6,000 trading days, and we have a sample of stock that appear on each of those 6,000 days. The idea is to construct a network that represents the New York Stock Exchange on each trading day, and then to use our entropies to explore how it changes structure as this network evolves with time. So what happens is the New York Stock Exchange is buffeted by various financial and economic events, and we see how the trading network between these different stock changes as a result of those external events. So how do we construct this network? Well, for each day we have the closing price for each of the stock, and we construct a network which captures the pattern of trades between the different stock present. So this is done by measuring the similarity of the pattern of closing prices for the different stock over a window time period, about 30 days. So if we think of the New York Stock Exchange as a graph, each node is a stock, and then each edge indicates similarity of trading pattern or closing price between a pair of stock. To compute those edges, that is to say to determine whether there's a strong correlation between the closing prices of a pair of stock, what we do is we compute the correlation of the closing prices over a 30-day window, and then we use the correlation value in order to, through a thresholding process, decide whether or not there's an edge. So this is how we do this. On each day we measure the correlation of the time series for each pair of stock. We create a pair of link between a pair of stock if the correlation exceeds the threshold, and this is usually taken that the correlation is in the top 10 percentile of correlations over the entire set of pairwise interactions. So this gives a time series of undirected graphs, each one representing the state of trading on a particular day. And what we want to do is to determine what these networks tell us about how trading patterns change on the New York Stock Exchange and how these are correlated to external events. We can also do this for a directed graph, and so what we do is we compute the correlation between the closing price time series with different time lags. We select the time lag which gives the maximum correlation. We again threshold the correlations to determine the edge set, and then we sign the edge to determine its directionality using the sign of the time lag. So this slide shows some example closing price time series that we correlate, and in the next slide what I've done is I've visualized the behavior of the network representing the trades in the New York Stock Exchange over time. These visualizations show different communities, different cluster structures within the network in different colors. We span a period of time around October, November 1987. This corresponds to the Black Monday crisis. What happened was that suddenly the prices of stock globally dropped, and the massive amounts of money were wiped off stock in almost all stock exchanges, and then after the crisis there was a slow recovery. So what I've done is shown in the top how the modular structure of the New York Stock Exchange changes with time as it approaches the Black Monday crisis, and then how it recovers afterwards. So what happens is that the community structure pretty well vanishes while we encounter the crisis, and then slowly a new community structure emerges after the crisis has passed. So we can ask ourselves now what happens to entropy as we move along the time series. So the Black Monday crisis is right to the left of this plot, and what I've shown here are the daily differences in entropy between the networks representing a New York Stock Exchange. So what you'll notice is that as we encounter Black Monday, the value of the entropy drops significantly, and then with a few significant differences in daily entropy, slowly recovers until we get a return to a pattern where there are very small daily changes in entropy. And if you go along this plot, you notice there are other events. And so, for instance, there is the Lehman Brothers crisis, the Asian crisis, the dot-com bubble, the attacks on the New York Trade Center. Each of these produces a significant daily change in entropy due to changes in structure of the network. You'll also notice that there is a sort of a change in behavior halfway along the plot, more or less. What happens is that after a particular time, then the daily changes in entropy become much more erratic. Now this is thought to be associated with the introduction of automatic trading, and this produces greater volatility in the structure of the trades on the New York Stock Exchange. So those are entropy differences. Let me just point out here, these are some values of the entropy for particular crises, and you can see that basically the crises are characterized by a local drop in entropy. What that really means is that we're looking at networks which are less random than at other times. This is the entropy for directed networks extracted from the New York Stock Exchange over the 6,000 days of trading for which we have data. And you see right at the beginning of this plot the event associated with Black Monday. And here the entropy drops suddenly and then slowly recovers. Other financial, political crises also produce sudden drops in the entropy of the network. So what does that mean? It means that the network is effectively being less connected. What happens in a crisis is that the network becomes associated with a more selective set of connections, and so its structure resembles less a fully connected graph. Here's a blow up of the value of the directed graph entropy as we go through the Black Monday crisis. You'll notice that the drop in entropy is sudden, and then it recovers by steps afterwards, and is almost back to the value that it was before the crisis after about 30 days. We can actually look at the entropy inventory to try to learn more about how the structure of a network changes. So for instance, we can look at the entropy associated with connections that vanish during a crisis, those that appear, and those that persist. And by looking at those, we're able to say certain things about the way in which the entropies behave. And here are the main conclusions. First is that the entropy drops during the crisis and remains lower than the pre-crisis level. It seems to be sort of associated with some phase transition in the network where low degree connections are being replaced by high degree connections, but fewer of them. And also, for instance, the network path length distribution is reduced in the network. So far I've just shown you how the entropy varies with time. We haven't attempted really to understand what it tells us about the similarity of structures within the network. And that's what I'd like to do in this section of the talk about network similarity, how entropy allows us to compare networks at different time epochs. So there, if you want to look into the story behind this, we have a recent paper in IEEE Transactions on Cybernetics, which summarizes our work on using graph kernels to represent network similarity and how we use entropy to compute these kernels. So the first thing I'd like to look at is something called entropy component analysis. There's a paper describing this in the Journal of Complex Networks that appeared in 2018, and it was work that I did with Cheng Yi as part of his PhD. So how does the idea here is to appreciate that our formula for entropy revolves around an indexing of the edges in a network according to the degrees that define them. So for instance, in an undirected graph, the edge is defined by the two node degrees. In a directed graph, the entropy is defined by the in and out degrees of the two nodes forming a directed edge. So the idea behind this piece of work is that we can think of the degrees as a node index, as an edge index. And so if we have an edge in a graph, let's take an undirected graph to begin with, if we take the pairs of degrees representing that edge, then all edges with the same degree configuration will have the same entropy. Okay, that's because the entropy is determined by 1 over du dv. And in the case of a undirected graph, it turns out that the edge is defined in terms of the in and out degrees. And if we take the case of a strongly directed graph, then it's just 3 of the 4 directed degrees that actually turn out to be important. So we can use either the node degrees in the case of an undirected graph, or the directed degrees in the case of a directed graph to index each edge. And if we index the edges according to degrees, we can then put them into a histogram whose axes are or bins are defined in terms of no degree, and use those histograms as a global characterization of the network that contain the edges summarized within them. And then once you have the entropy distribution in the form of a histogram indexed by no degree, we can then vectorize those histograms and start to apply ideas from statistical pattern recognition to analyze populations of vectorized histograms representing populations or of time series of networks. So here's an example of doing this. Here are the entropy histograms for two protein-protein interaction networks. And so we have Vorax on the left-hand side and Equifax on the right-hand side. And what you'll notice is that those two protein-protein interaction networks give rise to histograms which have a rather different shape. The one on the left-hand side is much more peaked than the one on the right-hand side. So that means that the distribution of entropy in those two protein-protein interaction networks is very different. So what happens if we apply this idea to the New York Stock Exchange data? Well, this is the result. What I've done here is I have computed a histogram for each network. I've converted that histogram into a vector, and I've performed principal component analysis on the vectors for all networks in the New York Stock Exchange data set. And we start to see a number of interesting features from this visualization of the data. So this is principal components analysis. I've just taken the three leading principal components and I've plotted each network in this space spanned by the three principal components. So here each network is a single point. So what you'll notice is that the distribution of networks breaks down into different components. We sort of have two continua here, the yellow and the blue, and these correspond to the effectively the background of the time series before and after the point at which the noise starts to become a little bit more erratic. And then we have points corresponding to the different financial crises which sit apart from these two manifolds representing the ordinary evolution of the New York Stock Exchange. So what that seems to suggest is that we can apply techniques from statistical pattern recognition and machine learning to analyze this data, provided that we put it into the right form to capture the types of entropy variations that we see. So that leads us on to graph kernels, and what we've been doing here is to study the link between the entropies that we've computed for networks and information theoretic kernels for effectively for the networks appearing in samples which we want to analyze. So if we think about kernels for network data, they represent efficient tools for processing high-dimensional data of the sort that we're finding in the form of time-evolving networks. They're based on the theory of walks on networks and information that can be derived from a network by a random walker. Now what I want to do is to focus not on some of the classical ideas like the path length kernel, which has been successfully used to analyze graph data, but on information theoretic kernels. Now, the Jensen-Shannon kernel is a information theoretic kernel for any kind of statistical data that can be computed, provided that we can compute the Jensen-Shannon divergence between the probability distributions for different samples. Now, the Jensen-Shannon divergence is computed in terms of the entropy of the statistical data we have, and what I've done in this slide here is written down the first of all the Jensen-Shannon kernel, which is the logarithm of 2 minus the Jensen-Shannon divergence between a pair of objects, in this case graphs, and the Jensen-Shannon divergence is the entropy of the composition of graphs Gi and Gj minus the entropy of the two graphs taken separately. So you can think of this as being rather like the entropy of the mixture minus the mixture of the entropies. So in order to do this, we need to have a composition or structure which allows us to combine a pair of graphs. Here we've taken the union graph as the structure we use. We take a pair of graphs, compute their union structure, and then compute the entropies of the original graph and the union structure in order to compute the Jensen-Shannon divergence. So this is how the union graph is defined. If we have an edge in the union graph, then it means that edge is present in either the one graph or the other. Other ways in which we might perform the composition operation: for instance, we could compute an intersection graph where the edge has to be present in both of the graphs being combined. So what we want to do is to use the kernel computed from the Jensen-Shannon divergence for pairs of graphs, and to see whether we can use this to embed the graph data into a vector space where the graph time series evolves as a series of points on a manifold within that space. So to do that, what we do is we take the Jensen-Shannon kernel matrix and we decompose it into the outer product of a pair of coordinate matrices, and then those coordinate matrices can be found by performing the eigendecomposition on the kernel matrix. So if we decompose the kernel matrix into a matrix of eigenvectors U, a diagonal matrix of eigenvalues lambda, then the embedding matrix is the square root of the eigenvalue matrix times the transverse of the eigenvector matrix. And this is the result of embedding the graphs into a vector space spanned by the leading eigenvectors of the kernel matrix. And on the left-hand side, I show the embedding for the complete time series of the New York Stock Exchange, going from the early data in blue, the late data and the time series in red. And what you notice here is the time series splits into two distinct populations, and they correspond to the data before automatic trading begins and after automatic trading has commenced. You can also use this method to take subsamples of this data and analyze them in the proximity of different financial crises. It allows us to explore how similar the networks are before and after the financial crisis has occurred. So in the last section, what I did was to show you how we could use representations based around network similarity to visualize distributions of graphs residing in a population, make conclusions about their their similarity and group structure based on that. In this part of the talk, what I want to do is to see whether we can say something more about how networks evolve with time. And so obviously, I mean, if we take, for instance, the New York Stock Exchange as an example, there we have a situation in which the networks evolve in a steady state sort of way until they encounter financial crises caused by external influences on the New York Stock Exchange, financial crises, political crises, so on and so forth. So I can't answer the question of when a crisis is going to hit the network. I can answer the question of how networks evolve between crises, and also whether there are any early indicators of the onset of a crisis. So let's go and have a look at this topic in a little more detail and answer the question of, well, what does entropy tell us about how networks evolve with time? So the first thing we need to do is to actually understand at a basic level what happens to the entropy as an edge in the graph evolves. So what we want to do is to consider an edge at two time epochs. Let's call them t and t plus 1. And at the initial epoch t, the edge connecting nodes u and v has node degrees du and dv. Then it evolves to the next time step, t plus 1, and node du has a degree du plus delta du at that stage, and node v has a degree dv plus delta v. So if we compute the difference in entropy between the network at time epoch t and time epoch t plus 1, then we get quite a complicated formula, written it down in the middle of the slide. The change in entropy is 1 over the number of nodes in the graph squared times the sum over all edges, and then we have a complicated expression which has a numerator and denominator. Let us focus on the numerator, and you see that has three terms. The first term is du, the degree of node u, times delta v, the change in degree of the node at the other end of the edge. The second term is the other way around. We have degree of node v times delta u, the change in degree of node u, and then we have a term which is the product of the two degree changes. So what is this? Well, it's effectively a correlation measure. It tells us how strongly the degree of a node at one end of an edge determines the change of degree at the other end. So in a sense, it's a measure of how coordinated the observed behavior of the different ends of the edge are. So what we'd like to be able to do is to use this measure to help us explore the structure of network time series and understand a little bit more about the evolution of the network as time evolves. So the first way I'm going to explore this is to construct a simple thermodynamic model. So I have the entropy, and so it would be interesting to compute other thermodynamic quantities for a network. So one of the things I can compute is the average internal energy, and that, if I use the definition on the top of the slide, if I define the average internal energy to be the trace of the square root of the degree times the Laplacian times the 1 over the square root of the degree, then I have an energy measure which counts the number of edges in a network. So internal energy is the number of edges within the network. The more edges, the more energetic we can consider it. We can then try to write down some thermodynamic equations for the state of the network, and underneath I've written down one of the thermodynamic equations. The change in internal energy is equal to the temperature times the change in entropy minus the pressure times the change in volume. Well, let me consider networks that never change their volume. So, for instance, the New York Stock Exchange has a fixed number of nodes, and if I take the volume of the network to be proportional to the number of nodes, that doesn't change, and so I only need to consider the first term to give the change in energy. That is, say du is dds. And so this allows me to define a temperature for a constant volume network. 1 over the temperature is given by the change in entropy divided by the change in internal energy. The change in internal energy is proportional to the change in number of edges, and so what I do is I just divide the expression I got for change in entropy in the previous slide by the change in the number of edges. And this gives me the formula for temperature. So 1 over temperature now is proportional to that correlation measure that I talked about on the previous slide. And so the stronger the correlation between the degree changes at the different ends of the edge and the original degrees, then the larger 1 over the temperature. So what that means is that highly correlated networks correspond to networks at low temperature. Highly uncorrelated networks correspond to networks at high temperature. So let's now take this representation and use it to visualize the distribution of networks in the New York Stock Exchange. So now what happens is we plot the networks in a space spanned by entropy, von Neumann entropy, internal energy, number of edges, and temperature. And what you see is that in this representation we again get a sort of a structure which represents the steady state evolution of the networks away from financial crises, and then the financial crises appear as outliers from that steady state distribution. So this is actually quite a powerful way of visualizing the networks and the relationship between steady state and crisis states of the network. So can we take this a little bit further? I've said nothing really in the previous slide about how we expect a network to evolve with time. Can we now use the change in entropy to try to set up a set of equations which describe how some of the properties of a network evolve with time, and then use those to try to see whether our predictions and observed behaviour correspond to each other. So the aim here is to understand how a statistical property of the network evolves. We're going to use the degree distribution of the nodes, and we're going to seek the distribution that minimises changes in entropy with time. And to do this, we're going to use a well-known variational framework, the so-called Euler-Lagrange equations. And what this is going to do is it's going to predict structural changes in the network. It's going to have nothing to say about the occurrence or whereabouts of the various political or economic crises that we've demonstrated exist as anomalies in network structure. So these are the Euler-Lagrange equations. What we do is we define some measure which we want to minimize on during the time evolution process. We call that G. It's a function of time, and some variables, we call those variables Q, and the time derivatives of those variables, Q dot T. So here I'm going to use a degree, and I'm going to use the rate of change of degree with time on the different nodes in the graph. So with that representation, the Euler-Lagrange equations are the rate of change of this quantity we're trying to minimize, minus the derivative, the time of this derivative with respect to the time derivatives of the variables, and that is equal to 0. So on this slide, what I do is I write down the quantity we're trying to minimize, and that is the entropy change, and then the Euler-Lagrange equations derived from this if we take the degrees to be the variables that we're interested in. So d dg du minus d dt dg and d delta u has got to be equal to 0. Okay, I won't really go through the steps in this, but those are the two derivatives we require: derivative of g with respect to degree and with respect to change in degree, and then underneath I've written the Euler-Lagrange equation, which gives the time evolution. So what we can do is compare the observed and simulated distributions of degrees predicted by the equation on the bottom of the previous slide, and compare it with real-world data. So this is for the New York Stock Exchange before and during Black Monday. The red is the observed distribution of degree, and the blue is our prediction of it. And the distributions there agree quite well, both in the period before and during the Black Monday crisis. So one more example here. What I can do is I can actually use this these time evolution equations to predict how the network evolves with time, and in the top I show a sequence of networks evolving through the Black Monday crisis, and then underneath are time predictions for the structure of those networks coming from the Euler-Lagrange analysis. Okay, so in this final section of the talk, what I want to do is to talk about developing finer models for the entropy of a network and applying the resulting entropy models to analyze brain connectivity data for subjects thought to be suffering from different stages of Alzheimer's disease. If you want to follow the methods described in this part of the talk, there's a paper by Jianjiao Wang, Richard Wilson and myself that appeared in the Journal of Complex Networks in 2017. So this is the idea. We're going to treat the network as providing us with a set of energy states, those defined by the Laplacian eigenvalues, and these energy states can be occupied by particles. We immerse the network in a heat bath. So as I say, the energy states defined by the Laplacian eigenvalues can be occupied according to the temperature of the system. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow the particles in this simulation to have either classical properties, that is to say, they follow the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, or the particles are going to have either integer or half-integer spins, and we will explore the effects of quantum statistics, that is to say, Bose-Einstein or Fermi-Dirac, on the occupation probabilities for the different energy levels. So, what are the different models we're going to adopt here? Maxwell-Boltzmann particles are effectively classical. They are weakly interacting and indistinguishable, and will occupy the energy levels of this heat bath analogy purely according to temperature. On the other hand, if we adopt quantum statistics, we have a different kind of behavior. In the case of bosons, that is to say, particles with integer spin, the distribution of particles over the energy states will, at a particular temperature, will follow Bose-Einstein statistics, and according to this, it's possible for a number of particles to occupy the same energy state. On the other hand, if we're dealing with half-integer particles, fermions, they are subject to the Pauli exclusion principle, and there can be only one particle in each energy state. Now these two different quantum occupation models will lead to rather different behaviours, and they'll lead to rather different forms of the entropy. So let's kind of underline those differences. In the quantum case, that is to say, where we have Bose-Einstein or Fermi-Dirac statistics, the particles are indistinguishable, while in the classical state they are distinguishable. In Bose-Einstein statistics, we have a greater tendency for particles to cluster in the same energy state than in the classical case, and in Fermi-Dirac statistics, particles are forced into the higher energy states by the exclusion principle. So the effect of temperature is to thermalize or randomize the occupation of the energy states. At low temperatures, the effect of the different types of statistics become evident, whereas when we raise the temperature, it's very difficult to distinguish the three different cases. So, adopting this model, without going into too many details, we get different expressions for the energies of the system of particles in the three different cases. I've just written them down here, and EI here, the energy states of the system, mu is the mean energy state, and beta is 1 over the temperature. Similarly, we get different expressions for entropy, and I've written down here the entropies for the Boltzmann, Bose-Einstein and Fermi-Dirac cases. And here L twiddle is the normalized Laplacian, beta is again 1 over the temperature, mu the average energy level, and as you see, we get three rather different expressions for the entropy. So what I want to do is to apply these different forms of the entropy to try to understand the distribution of entropy across edges in networks representing brain activation patterns in subjects thought to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, and in particular subjects in different stages of development of the disease. If you would like to find out more about this study, there's a recent paper by Manuel Corrado, Francesco Escalano, Miguel Angelo Lozano and myself appears in Entropy in 2020. So, what is Alzheimer's disease? Well, it's a neurodegenerative disease. It accounts for 60 or 70% of the cases of dementia. What happens is that people suffering from it suffer from short-term memory loss in the early stages, and then also problems with motor control in the later stages. The disease is ultimately fatal and progressive, and a very large percentage of the world population is eventually subject to this disease. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to look at data from the ADNI initiative. It is fMRI data which is used to measure the oxygenation level dependent bold signals in different anatomical regions of the brain. And in this study there are 96 different anatomical brain regions, and we have 4 different groups of patients. We denote these as AD, healthy, EMCI and LMCI. And they correspond to full Alzheimer's disease, 30 patients, healthy control samples, 38 patients, early mild cognitive impairment, that's early stage of development of Alzheimer's disease, and late mild cognitive impairment, which is late development but not full development of the disease. And here we have 34 patients. So this slide is stolen from Wiki and illustrates what the blood oxygenated level dependent signal conveys. It's detected using a dopant in fMRI. This allows you to measure how much oxygen is taken up by different regions of the brain, while a subject is allowed to respond to different kind of activation stimuli. And the more oxygen absorbed by a particular region of the brain, the greater the amount of brain activity under that particular stimulus. So what happens is that BOLD reveal the excitation of regions as a time series, and we treat this time series very much like we did the New York Stock Exchange. We look for correlations between the time series in different regions, measuring correlations in the BOLD signal, and we establish a connection if the correlation exceeds a particular threshold value. So this is the anatomy of the brain, the different regions studied, and we have 96 labelled regions in the brain for which the BOLD signals are available, and these are the different regions of cognitive function. The important one for this study is the green one, which is associated with memory, and that is known, short-term memory is known to be impaired by Alzheimer's disease. The mechanism for that is that the region is thought to become impaired by the formation of plaque, and this reduces the connectivity of the region. So here are examples of different activation networks for different classes of patient. The top left-hand panel shows a patient suffering from Alzheimer's disease. The top right-hand one is a patient or subject from the control sample, and then we see the effects of early and late cognitive impairment on the structure of the brain. So what we'd like to do is to use our entropies to try to distinguish between these different structures and perform a statistical separation of them. So what we want to do is to explore whether there's a differences in the structure of fMRI networks for different cohorts of subjects, and the four cohorts we're dealing with are normal, EMCI, NMCI, and full Alzheimer's. Okay, so this is how we do it. We identify those regions of interest that have the greatest interclass entropy variance. So what that means is we look for the pairs of regions where there is greatest variance in the entropy of the connecting edge. And what we then do is to put those entropies, those largest variance edge entropies, as the components of a feature vector, and then perform various forms of statistical analysis on them. Here we're going to use linear discriminant analysis, and so this is a supervised technique. We use some of our data for training, and then attempt to use some of the remaining data to estimate the classification accuracy for distinguishing between Alzheimer's and non-Alzheimer's patients. Particularly, we would like to be able to distinguish between normal patients and those who have early mild cognitive impairment, because that's indicative of subtle changes due to the onset of the disease. So this plot shows those pairs of regions which have the greatest variance in edge entropy, and what I've done here is listed the top 10 regions of interest which have the greatest edge entropy. So these are the pairs of regions. If we look at those edges, connecting them, they have the greatest variance over the sample of data. So as we move from one class of patient to the other, the edge entropy for the edges connecting these regions shows the greatest variation. So this is a an example of using linear discriminant analysis to see whether we can separate the 4 different classes of patient. And here we have computed the entropy using Maxwell-Boltzmann statistics. That's the classical example. And so there is quite a good degree of overlap in this data. If we then move to the Bose-Einstein model, some of the classes become better separated. For instance, here we can separate Alzheimer's disease from the early, normal, and late cognitive impairment classes. And then this is the Fermi-Dirac distribution, where we get the best separation of all. So what's the difference between the Bose-Einstein and Maxwell and Fermi-Dirac case? Well, in case of Bose-Einstein, we tend to get crowding of the particles into the lower energy states, and so this will just tell us whether it measure things like the spectral gap. In other words, it will tell us whether there is a kind of a cluster structure in the amongst the regions in the brain. On the other hand, the Fermi-Dirac statistics sample most of the energy levels of the system, and that means that we're able to distinguish subtleties in the differences in degree distribution for the different networks. Okay, and now here is a final example where we try to distinguish between the healthy control sample, shown in blue, and the early cognitive impairment class using the indiscriminate analysis, and on the basis of that, you see we can separate those 2 classes quite clearly, and that means that we can distinguish between the early development of the disease and normal brains, and it means that the method is picking up subtleties in difference in connectivity structure. Okay, so let's conclude. What I've done in this talk is to show that network entropy is a powerful tool for analysing both network populations and network time series. In particular, I've focused on edge entropy, which I've shown it can be used as a tool to probe changes in network structure and understand network evolution. And I provided some real-world examples based on financial time series and the study of Alzheimer's disease to illustrate the utility of these methods. So if, like me, you're self-isolating and you've just listened to this talk, I think you deserve a reward. I recommend that you make yourself a spritz. The recipe for that is you take 1 portion of Prosecco, 1 portion of Aperol, and 1 portion of sparkling mineral water, mix them together, add some ice cubes and a slice of lemon. Remember, don't overdo the mineral water. So thank you very much indeed for listening.